Hello, guys. I'm Justin.
And I'm Chris, and today we're here to talk about something very close to our hearts. Caffeine.
So, we all know it, and most of us love it, or at least need it, to survive every day. You know, it's in our coffees, it's in our teas, it's in our Coco Yen Wan Noi, our Chatham Yen Lon. It's in our Coca-Colas, our chocolate bars, and our Red Bulls.
But how does caffeine actually work? Where does it come from, and what effects does it have on us?
Let's start with what caffeine is. So, Chris, if you would care to tell us.
I would love to. Well, caffeine is a drug that stimulates and increases the activity of your brain and nervous system, and it is also naturally found in different plants such as coffee, tea, and cacao. And did you know caffeine is also one of the most consumed dietary ingredients in the world?
I did not know that. That's very interesting.
Now you do.
And it's also worth taking a look at the roots of caffeine, because how did it get to this point? The first traces of caffeine usages can be traced back to as early as 850 AD, where, legend has it, there was a goat herder who, after feeding his goats some berries from an Arabica plant nearby, found that they were super hyped up and excited. I guess you could say they thought it was the goat.
However, caffeinated drinks were enjoyed way before then, around 3000 BC. This is Chinese legend that a Chinese emperor in a cold day was enjoying a hot cup of water.
As one did during those times.
Yes, of course. And out of nowhere, it was a very windy day that day. And wind just blows tea leaves into his cup of water. And then, for some reason, he still takes a sip out of it. Yeah, and then he was like, I tell you what, folks, that's bloody nice. He felt energized afterward.
Well, that was a stroke of luck, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this joyous beginning sadly took a bitter turn as the coffee industry, as well as the sugar farming industry, which of course went hand in hand with it, became increasingly mainstream and popular in the future, which also led rise to it becoming heavily dependent on slave labor.
But in more modern moral times, caffeine has become a large part of human life and may even have helped propel societies forwards. Yeah. And coffee houses and tea parlors from around the world were starting points of many scientific, cultural, and political exchanges. The increased focus and concentration caffeine gave to those who consumed it essentially improved their productivity and reduced human errors. I'm sure this is all something we're familiar with.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, as of now, in current day, caffeine is the second most traded commodity on the planet, right after big number one, oil. It's also one of the most widely used and abused psychoactive stimulants in the world as well. But how exactly does caffeine do all these magical things? What exactly happens after you take a sip of coffee? So, caffeine itself is rapidly absorbed. Almost 90% of it will be absorbed within 45 minutes of consumption. Now, once you drink a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, right, it travels to your liver and is broken down into various compounds, but the real interesting stuff happens in the brain. Now, as Chris mentioned earlier, caffeine acts as a central nervous system stimulant, which essentially helps to prevent you from getting tired.
But why do we get tired?
Well, that's actually an interesting question if you look a little deeper. So, on the biological level, right, throughout the day, from the moment you open your eyes, your body begins accumulating a chemical known as adenosine. Now, adenosine relaxes the brain and sort of makes it feel sleepy. It does this by sliding into these little slots in various locations around your body, which activate its secret power, sleepiness. Now, specifically, these slots are known as adenosine receptors.
Let's talk more about adenosine receptors. And for those of you who are watching, you're probably wondering, what are receptors? Well, receptors are proteins that binds itself to a specific molecule and causes a specific effect. And adenosine comprises of 4 different receptors. That includes A1, A2A, A2B, and then A3. So when caffeine is ingested, 2 of the receptors that I just mentioned gets blocked. So the first receptor that gets blocked is A1. So once the first receptor, A1, gets blocked, that no longer promotes sleepiness, and in turn you will feel more alert.
Yay.
Yeah. When receptor A2A is blocked, a slight increase in other signaling molecules such as dopamine, their levels increases, which is thought to improve your mood.
Really?
Yeah. Wait, hold on. That doesn't mean you should chug your second bottle of M150.
Why not?
Because a study showed that having a second cup of coffee or second of this it doesn't really change your levels in dopamine until 8 hours after your first cup of coffee.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah, so put that back.
Well, to summarize what Chris was saying, caffeine is basically sus. It acts as an adenosine imposter, sliding into your adenosine receptors and blocking adenosine from getting in. The biological term for what caffeine does in this context is known as an antagonist. However, caffeine is the hero of our story, as it helps to prevent us from getting sleepy. Speaking of sleep, as many of you are probably aware, caffeine has some less good effects on your sleep. So after consumed, caffeine takes quite a while to metabolize. It has a half-life of 5 to 7 hours on average for most people. And by half-life, we mean the time it takes for your body to synthesize 50% of a certain drug, not the game. Although you should play the game, buy the game. This, of course, does depend on genetics as well. We probably know some people who can, chug down a coffee with dinner and get to sleep by midnight. But for others, it takes a much longer time to completely eliminate caffeine from their bodies. Interestingly enough, it may be the case that smokers can better metabolize caffeine as well, as the enzyme that breaks down nicotine also does the same for caffeine. And, naturally smokers would have more of this enzyme present in their bodies at any given time.
So there's a relatively high likelihood that this will affect your nighttime snooze.
In particular, this basically involves difficulty falling asleep. However, once you've already fallen asleep, it can also affect your deep sleep, which is the stage of sleep that leaves you feeling more well-rested and alert in the morning.
Yeah, and this impact can leave you feeling a little sluggish in the morning and more likely to grab a cup of coffee.
This almost sounds like an addiction, doesn't it?
Are we addicted to caffeine? Can you get addicted to caffeine?
Well, it turns out the answer to that is yes. Yes, you can. Although it's classified as a dependence, not an addiction. So, while caffeine does increase dopamine levels in the brain a bit, as you mentioned earlier, it's not significant enough to activate the brain's reward system. So it may give you a little buzz, but it's definitely no heroin, okay? So, but you may find yourself needing more and more coffee to get the same buzz, as you can develop a tolerance to caffeine fairly quickly. So, how exactly do you know if you're dependent on caffeine?
Well, if you're dependent on caffeine and somehow find yourself without caffeine for a while, then you may experience some of the following, which is a headache. You might get a little ache in your head. You might feel a little fatigued, a little drowsy. You might be irritated.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, irritated about, people, animals, about life. And lastly, you might be feeling a little depressed.
Sadly, there's only one way to lower your caffeine. Gotta cut back.
Well, that's it for today, and thank you guys for joining us on our journey through the world of caffeine.
Yeah, we hope the next time you have yourself a cup of coffee, you think about what you learned today.
And speaking of coffee, we'd like to recommend our personal favorite source of caffeine, Kopiko Lucky Day coffee.
It's got 86 milligrams of caffeine per 100 milliliters, so about 150-ish milligrams of caffeine total, which is more than the average canned coffee, but not too much as to give you an instant headache.
It's got 13 grams of sugar. It's sweet and creamy.
It used to be the cheapest coffee, 13 baht, with the most caffeine, so you get the most bang for your buck. Although it's 15 baht now, it's still worth it.
It's true. Before Kopiko Lucky Day, my life was a little grey. I didn't know what to do with myself, and I could never focus in class. But after I found out about Kopiko Lucky Day coffee, I found the true definition of happiness. I found myself.
I understand, man. I understand. Like during hectic times when, I wasn't sleeping enough, like things were so hectic, I had to skip breakfast and skip lunch. Kopiko Lucky Day kept me standing. It was there for me. There to support me. We're not sponsored by Kopiko, but if they'd like to sponsor us, please reach out.
Alright guys, thank you for watching and goodbye.
Bye. My babies.